Today I'm going to be talking about Solomon. And if you're anything like me, the name Solomon also means wisdom, and you think of wisdom, and you almost immediately think of the one instance that we have in the Old Testament of a story involving Solomon's wisdom, and that is the story of the two mothers with their two babies. One baby dies, and both mothers claim to have the live baby as theirs, and Solomon finds a way of solving this. That's in chapter 3 of 1 Kings, and that's the only instance I could find of an illustration of Solomon's wisdom. On the other hand, at the end of chapter 4, there's quite a few verses, and I'd just like to go through this. God gave Solomon wisdom and understanding beyond measure. Throughout the rest of this chapter, it talks about the various areas in which Solomon had displayed wisdom. It ends by saying, "And men came from all peoples to hear of the wisdom of Solomon, and from all the kings of the earth who had heard of his wisdom." And this is followed very quickly by the story of the Queen of Sheba coming to test Solomon to see how wise he actually was. Well, we're not going to talk about Solomon's wisdom. There was another aspect of Solomon's reign as king that was quite interesting to me, and that was his building program. Solomon had two big building programs very early on in his reign. Let's very quickly go over a couple of things that are pertinent in terms of when these things were taking place. David moved his kingdom from Hebron to Jerusalem around 1000 BC. It was not too long after that he became involved with Bathsheba, and they had a son who died, and then later another son, and that was Solomon. Solomon was probably born around, I would say 980, 998, 997 BC or so. David lives to about the age of 70, and he dies in 970, 971. Solomon comes on the throne. Actually, he would only be about 27 or 28 years old. He was only probably in his late 20s. He was still a comparatively young man. What was rather pertinent is that the thing that David had done is that he had created a very interesting kingdom, and partly because there wasn't anybody to bother him, he was extremely successful, and he made it a rather rich kingdom. As a matter of fact, by the time Solomon came on the throne, it probably made Solomon one of the richest men in the world at that time for a number of reasons. And we'll talk about this. Well, one of the things that Solomon wanted to do was to get involved in some building. One of the buildings he wanted to build definitely was a palace for himself, and the other was to build the temple. Now, the temple had been assigned to him because David was not going to build the temple. David had been told by the Lord that because his hands had been bloodied so many times, he was not going to build the temple. On the other hand, his son Solomon would build the temple. These are the two building projects that Solomon took on himself when he, like I say, in his late 20s. This is from the New Testament. "Consider the lilies, how they grow. They neither toil nor spin, yet I tell you, even Solomon, all his glory was not arrayed like one of these." Now, why did I say this? Because Solomon was very successful. This is just one scene that was painted that indicates the type of a home that he was in, or his palace. This is a picture in which we find the Queen of Sheba being greeted by Solomon. We have all these lions here. These are all in gold, and a very sizable place. We're not going to talk too much about his palace. We're going to talk a little bit more about his temple. The temple was something else. It was something quite different. We find out that I want to get to some times here. Solomon took it upon himself to build the temple in his 4th year of his reign. And what we're told is it took him about 11 years to build the temple. The temple was completed somewhere around 550 or 957 BC. It was a very distinctive building for a number of reasons. One of the reasons is one that we can see just by looking at this particular picture of the temple. That's a man. That is a tall building. How many of you have had people tell you that you go to a church that looks like little town of Bethlehem? Have you ever heard that? There's something that's kind of interesting about our church in that it looks like a very low-lying village. That contrasts quite a bit from a lot of other churches which are tall with steeples. Our church, it was made to imitate what it was like in Palestine at the time of Christ. There were no tall buildings. The reason being that most buildings at that time were made out of mud brick. And you don't go much more than 2 stories with a mud brick building before it starts to crumble on you. You need something with a little bit more of a structural backbone. In Palestine, you don't find very many trees that grow more than 6 to 10 feet. You have olive trees and things of that sort. There's no lumber that's going to make it possible to build something that is as tall as this. However, Solomon had a way of doing that. I'll get to that in a moment. Had a way of doing that by getting in a partnership with a man named Hiram, who was the king of Tyre, who had access to some forests way up north, the forests of Lebanon, where we have what we call the cedars of Lebanon. And what was decided is that Solomon would build this temple with the help of Hiram, of getting the lumber that would be necessary, and build it on a place in Jerusalem that had already been found, had already been designated by his father. We find in Samuel that David purchased a part of Mount Moriah, which was in the center of Jerusalem, to build an altar. He was not allowed to build a temple. And Solomon decided it was on that plot of land that David had bought for that altar that he would build that temple. And then with the help of Then with the help of Hiram, he would start to build the temple. Before I get into that, I want to take a look at a couple of things that I found quite interesting about the dimensions of the temple. This is the dimensions of the temple for the house of the Lord. Check this. 60 or 90 feet long, 20 cubits by 20. I don't know where something got lost in here. Oh, this is the dimensions of his palace. You notice something? The palace is much larger than the temple. As a matter of fact, he built the temple in about 7 years, whereas it took him 13 years to build his palace, which was considerably larger. But getting back to the story here, in order to build that temple, these are some of the building materials that he needed. He needed building materials like lumber and stone. I talked about the lumber already. He was going to get that from the forests of Lebanon. But there also were temple artifacts, gold and bronze. And we want to talk a little bit about the source of these materials that went into this temple. Lumber. True forest characteristic by tall trees with straight boles. You wouldn't find them. They were absent in Palestine. You had to go all the way on up to Lebanon. Here's a picture with Hiram. He and were plotting to get that material from Lebanon down into Palestine. Here's a picture of a tall tree. Now, why did trees grow tall in Lebanon? because it was a mountainous region and had a lot of streams, a lot of water, and was quite different from Palestine, which was much more of what you might say of a desert. As a matter of fact, part of Judea, it was actually referred to as the Judean desert, and there were not going to be very many tall trees. Here's a couple of pictures that are actually photographs involving the lumber. I wish you could see that a little carefully. You see that the size of these trees was considerable. And a tremendous amount of lumber could be, a tremendous amount of paneling and things could be obtained from that. These are saw marks that you see. Now the reason I mention this is it'll show up a little bit later, that there had to be the capability of doing that type of sawing. We also see a picture here that indicates the size of these trees, very tall trees. Among the things that these trees were used for were the masts of sailing ships. The mast of a sailing ship has to be a tall, straight pole, and the cedars of Lebanon worked out very nicely in that regard. However, Lebanon is hundreds of miles north of Jerusalem. Oh, here's another picture involving the size of the trunks of these trees. I think I'll just go to the next slide. The Hiram with Solomon decided to get that lumber down there. And I think you may recall a couple of weeks ago we talked about the fact that one way that was used to do that was a waterway. And actually the lumber from the cedars of Lebanon were floated down the Mediterranean coast all the way down to Joppa, which I think is on the next slide here. All the way, here's the whole long trip. And then they had to be carried over the land into Jerusalem. Thus, what we find is that Solomon did have the capability of getting the type of lumber that he needed to build something that was tall. And that is the reason that we find this very tall building that is designated as the temple. The next thing he had to be concerned with was a stone. Now, I found this a rather interesting aspect because I first read this. When the house was built with stone, prepared in the quarry, and so they had to hammer it out in such a way that there was no noise in the temple, in the presence of the temple. Another thing that was mentioned is that, well, it doesn't show it, the foundation was costly. It said it took a lot of effort to get that stone. One of the things that went through my mind is I remembered many times hearing about the building of the pyramids in Egypt. The internal stones in the pyramids of Egypt, many of them were quarried out of the region right around the pyramids. But the outer layer was all granite. There is no granite in that part of the world. As a fact, that granite had to be ferried all the way from Aswan, about 300 or 400 miles up the Nile River to get the granite that they would put on the outside of the pyramids. Well, when I started to read about this costly stone that they were using, I wondered where in the world did that stone come from? That turned out to be very interesting. Again, mention about the costly stones. I wish we could see that, but this Sovic did not take that into consideration. Again, more about the stone. The stones came from a long ways away, 2 blocks away from where the temple was being built. They came right from Jerusalem. In Jerusalem is an entrance to what we call Solomon's Quarry, a quarry which was an entrance into some caves in which they were able to obtain limestone. How much limestone? There are tunnels in these quarries. There are tunnels that go literally for miles. For years and years, they've been quarrying out limestone out of that area that was right underneath the surface of Palestine. I read one place it seemed to be possible, if you wanted to do so, you could use those tunnels and go all the way from Jerusalem to Jericho. They have been quarrying that limestone for many years. Now, what is limestone? Limestone is nothing but calcium carbonate that has been crystallized to make it very hard. It comes from sea creatures. At one time, apparently, Palestine was all underneath water, underneath the sea. I looked into this a little bit and found out that water became a part of this planet maybe about 4.5 billion years ago. And there may have been sea creatures starting to show up as long as maybe about 3.5 billion years ago. Well, when the sea creatures would die, they would often have a carcass that involved a what? A calcium carbonate shell. And that shell would be deposited on the floor of the sea. Well, you can see that at time you'd get a layer of that. If you have a layer that maybe is 1/10 of an inch thick every 100 years, but you do this for about 3 or 4 billion years, you'd be surprised the size that you get. And it turns out that the better part of Palestine actually has this limestone underneath it. And even to this day, they are still mining this limestone, and it's one of the principal sources of income in parts of Palestine. Actually, the entrance that I showed you is often referred to as Zedekiah's cave, because later in the history of the Jews, Zedekiah, one of the kings, hid out in that cave, and when he came out of the cave was when he was captured by the Babylonians, but that's another whole story. Here is a map. Well, you can't see it unfortunately. Here is Mount Moriah. This is where the temple was built. And right over here is the stone quarries, the entrance to the stone quarries. So they were able to get all of the limestone they wanted. But now, I mentioned the fact that it was stated that it was very costly. The reason that it was costly is what they did with the limestone. They didn't just take chunks of limestone, but they shaped it. As a matter of fact, they made it smooth so that both on the outside and on the inside, you'd have a smooth layer. And they had to make it beveled so that limestones could lie on top. This all had to be done by very laborious work of shaping that limestone into these proper forms to have these smooth sides. This is where the cost actually came in. And the limestone formation, as I indicated, over a couple of billion years is probably not too surprising. And this indicates that what I had also said, that even to this very day, this limestone is a very important part of the economy of Palestine. Bronze. Bronze and gold were two of the metals that we find rather prevalent in the temple. Bronze especially. Gold is a different situation. But what is bronze? Bronze is an alloy that is made of copper and, for the most part, tin. Generally, bronze is approximately 88% copper and about 12% tin. Now, the beauty of bronze is that it is very hard. It is a very strong sort of metal. It is not only ornamental, as brass is, but brass is much softer. And copper, of course, is quite soft. But bronze was actually capable of being used for warfare. Spears and swords were made out of bronze. As a matter of fact, the Greeks had a whole era in which they had bronze armor. Bronze was also very important for another thing. They could make something else out of bronze that was useful. And you know what that was? Saws. Now, I showed you those great big trunks of these trees, and the big trees in the Lebanon that had to be taken down, and they had to be trimmed. And fortunately, because of the fact there was bronze available, they were able to make saws. Now, why were they able to have so much bronze? Well, part of the reason they had so much bronze is they had very good contact with Hiram, who had worked quite extensively with his people in bronze, and we find that they had a source of bronze. Now I'll tell you about the source of bronze. I don't think it shows on this map. No. If you take a look at the whole kingdom that was available to Solomon at that time, you'd find out that it extends all the way from north of the Sea of Galilee, all the way down to the Gulf of Aqaba, all the way down through that region of the Arabah, which was a place where there were a lot of earthquakes and things of this sort. And there were two locations in that region where there was a lot of copper, and there was copper mining. Timnah was one of the regions in which we had all this copper available. I thought I had a map here. Timnah is very near the Gulf of Aqaba, way down south, and it was a very insignificant source of copper. Actually, north of that was another copper mine that existed way back to as far back as 5000 BC that people were mining copper. But there seemed to have been a lot of copper that was in that region that ran from the Dead Sea down to the Gulf of Aqaba. We've talked about the fact that this was a great big rift in the land. It was a part of what was referred to as the African rift that goes all the way down into Africa. And there were these two large copper mines which made copper available and it made bronze available. And as a consequence, they were able to make many things out of bronze, many very significant things out of bronze. What we find is that with the help of Hiram, there were these two bronze pillars. They are named Boaz and Jachin. These pillars, if you look at if you remember the picture that we had of the temple, these were pillars that were standing on the side of the doors of the temple. We'll see a picture of that in a moment. There were other things that were made out of bronze. There was this huge basin, huge bath, you might say, with all of these cattle holding up this basin. I think there's another picture. In the back, you see, I think there were 7 of these other places. They were called lavers. They were like lavatories where people could wash themselves. These were all made out of bronze. Why were they made out of bronze? Because they had a lot of copper. I want to just talk a little bit more about this. I have another place in the scriptures there where it actually says that they did not even bother to take account of how much bronze was put into the temple because there was so much of it and they had so much of it available. And in fact, that they had so much of it available, it means that they also had a means of using the currency of their own. Because when we get to the next thing that we have, and that is gold, there is no native gold in Palestine. As a matter of fact, there's no gold in Palestine. It all had to be imported. If you go back a couple of lessons back, you may recall we talked about all of these sea voyages that were made by Hiram and by Solomon and by David, in which many things that came from Africa ended up in Palestine by the maritime efforts of Hiram. They were able to buy gold, and they bought a lot of gold, a tremendous amount of gold. And they put that gold into all of these different places that I think I mentioned. This is just taken from the book of Kings, of a golden altar, another lampstands of pure gold, all of these utensils of gold all over. Another indication that what was true is that Solomon was very, very wealthy and had the capability of buying all the gold that he wanted to have put into the temple. I think I have another slide here that I found kind of interesting because I don't know how this person came up with this. Somebody figured out, if you take a look at all the things that are designated as being made of gold, if you were to use today's gold prices, whatever the price of gold is today, the cost for just the gold would be $194 billion. There was a lot of gold that was in the temple, to say the very least. There was also silver, but not nearly as much silver as there was gold. I'm going to go over this rather quickly. We're going to run out of time. That gives you a little bit of the cost in one regard. There's another cost. We go back to Kings 5. Solomon also had 70,000 burden bearers and 80,000 hewers of stone in the hill country. All that work that I mentioned, it was costly as far as those stones. Where was he getting it? He was getting it from the people. Actually, I think I may have another one here that indicates that Solomon also sent men up to Lebanon to work in other words, they were drafting the people by the thousands to go and work, to get the lumber that they needed, to get the stone out of the Solomon's quarry, to form the stone in the shape that they wanted it formed. Solomon put a lot of people to work to get this temple built the way that he wanted it built. In that period of building, which went on for about, well, it was about 13 years before the palace was built, the people were really burdened with a lot of effort. They did not forget it. As a matter of fact, throughout the whole kingdom of Solomon, the people were in a situation that they did not find favorable. Solomon lived a long time. He actually reigned for about 40 years, and it wasn't until about 930 BC that Solomon died, and he was succeeded by his son Rehoboam. What happened when Rehoboam became king? Some of the people approached Rehoboam and said, "Your father had made us work very hard. Can you not relieve us of a little bit of this burden of doing all of this labor that was necessary for all this building that he wanted accomplished during his lifetime?" And Rehoboam took it upon himself to get advice as to what he should do in terms of dealing with that problem. He listened to the elders, and the elders told Rehoboam, "Look, ease up on the people. They've had a hard time throughout all of Solomon's reign." But he also listened to the young men, and the young men had a different attitude. If Solomon treated you rough, think of what Rehoboam can do. And Rehoboam decided that he answered in the favor of the young people and said, "If you think it was tough under Solomon, wait until you see what I can do." And how many of you know right offhand what happened? The kingdom split, just like that. This building program came up with some great buildings, great edifices, but it was at the cost of the kingdom, because after Solomon, Rehoboam became the king of the United Kingdom, but it was only a matter of a short time before the northern 10 tribes separated themselves and formed the kingdom of Israel. And all was left was the kingdom of Judah with Benjamin. That was all that was left of Rehoboam. And as a matter of fact, even during Rehoboam's reign, the Egyptians had moved in and had taken control over a good part of the territory. So it's kind of an interesting situation that what we find is that we go from the very sublime under Solomon to what's not quite so good. I've mentioned this before, that people have talked about the fact that people can learn from history. This is a very interesting situation where you have a very successful king like David, who's followed by a son who takes advantage of that success and is very extravagant with that success. And then, as in the case of Solomon and Rehoboam, the kingdom fails. A couple of hundred years later, a very similar thing happened in the empire of Assyria. Sennacherib, when he left Jerusalem after holding Jerusalem hostage for a while, went back to Nineveh. And when he was in Nineveh, within a few years, he was assassinated by one of his sons. And another son took over, a son by the name of Esarhaddon. And Esarhaddon, we do not learn very much about in the Bible, other than he was very successful. In contrast to almost anybody else, Esarhaddon was able to take the Assyrian Empire all the way down the Nile River and had control of Egypt. He was at the very pinnacle. And as far as the Assyrian Empire, it was during Esarhaddon's reign that they were at their peak. He was followed by Ashurbanipal. What did Ashurbanipal get involved in? He got involved in building. He got involved in being very extravagant. I hope I don't fall. He got involved in very extravagant. Now, we can fault him in a bit. One of the things that Ashurbanipal did was establish this library that later on was discovered, and as far as archaeologists are concerned, is one of the greatest discoveries that was ever found in the Far East, in the Near East. But there's another interesting thing about Ashurbanipal. It's very hard to find the names of any of the emperors that succeeded him. They are mentioned once in a while, because what happened to the Assyrian Empire? It collapsed. It collapsed. It's the same pattern that we find with David and Solomon and Rehoboam. We find happening with Ashurbanipal, I'll say Esarhaddon and Ashurbanipal, and then the ones that succeeded him. The other thing that I wanted to talk a little bit about today was the rather interesting situation that you find that they were able to produce a tremendous amount of bronze and gold. Where did this come from? How much gold is indigenous to the earth? How much copper is part of the earth? Actually, none of it. Every bit of copper, every bit of iron, every bit of gold, you know where it comes from? Exploding stars. It comes from exploding stars. These stars explode and the debris is sent out in space. And little by little, some of that debris, as meteors, lands in different places. Once in a while, it will land on the earth. This is how we happen to have the situation that on Earth we find very many places where there are deposits of heavy metals. Heavy metals are not a part of the Earth originally. They are all coming from outer space. You say, how can this happen? We don't see that very many meteors. This has been going on for about 4 billion years. You only have to have a couple of centuries to make it last quite a few. Some of them could be rather extensive. For example, up in northern Michigan, there must have been deposits of meteors containing tremendous amounts of iron. Because what do we have up there? Iron mines. Where do we find gold? We find gold everywhere? No. Just in certain places where there had been meteoritic showers that included some of the gold that had been produced in some of these exploding stars. And I found reading about gold to be rather interesting. This had been going on for a long time, and in the interior of the earth are tremendous amounts of gold. There's not that much gold on the surface of the earth. On the surface of the earth, I read one place that if you were to take all the gold that has been mined and discovered and utilized by man since the beginning of the discovery of gold, it would occupy a cube that's only about 30 feet across and high, or 30 yards. Not an awful lot. If you go to the interior, there is evidence that there's enough gold in the interior that you could cover the whole surface of the earth to a depth of about 7 feet with gold, but it's all in the interior. So at one time there must have been a lot of exploding stars that deposited gold on this planet. one of the things I came across that was quite interesting is that people were always asking the question, why do they set up gold mining places? Why do they work in gold mining places and try to recover gold? And the answer was very simple. That's where the gold is. It isn't everywhere. You got to find out where the gold is. I came across something else that I found that was quite interesting. And that is that there is a place on the internet where you can read about earthquakes that take place where? In the Alaska region. Because when there's an earthquake, it will uncover parts of the crust of the earth that have not been looked at before. And guess what they might find there? Gold. And there are people that follow earthquakes just to be able to find the gold in that fashion. It's kind of interesting to ask that question. Where did all those metals come from? They came from exploding stars. I don't know very much about this, but I did a little bit of a reading and it made me think a little bit about the fact that we have interesting situations that exist in the cosmos. And one of these is exploding stars. And when stars explode, there are going to be objects that are moving at velocities that are unbelievable. And you will find the nuclei of different elements combining with each other. What they call that fusion. And when they combine, they'll form a different element. Sometimes they'll form a different element that is that splits into other element. And in these exploding stars, then there must have been the situation where there was a lot of times when you would have these fusions taking place and gold would be formed, and then the whole star would burst, and this gold or iron or copper or tungsten or silver or whatever it is floating around through the galaxy, and some of it eventually will actually fall on the earth. And then we will find the places that we can, you might say, harvest this material in this fashion. How this actually takes place, nobody knows. What I found rather interesting is that it would take tremendous amounts of velocity for things like this to occur. What's going on in Switzerland right now with this Bern accelerator? They are taking protons and trying to get them at a speed that's high enough so that they will bounce into other protons and smash them apart. Have you seen the pictures of that very big circular thing? Can you imagine the velocities that you might find in an exploding star? They would make this Bern accelerator look like a boy's toys compared to what goes on. So a lot of things could be happening in the cosmos and in the galaxies that, in a way, are hard for us to understand, but explain why we find certain things to be true here on Earth, such as finding places where we find iron, where we find gold, where we find copper. They came from these exploding stars. What I also found rather interesting in going through this material was the fact that you see evidence of some parts of the economy of the people at that time. There was an interaction between the people in the forestry up in Lebanon. They needed the saws. And where were they getting the saws? From the fact that the bronze was available to give them saws. The same thing was true of the people in the quarries. The other thing that I thought was rather interesting, when you take a look at the overall situation of everything that went on in the building of these edifices, of the palace and of the temple, it's kind of interesting to think about it in terms of what do we have left. We have nothing in archaeology of either Solomon's temple nor of his palace. They are all buried too deep down in Jerusalem for us to be able to find anything at all. Was there a heritage? Yeah, we found out that the whole political scene was changed. Why? Even though there was a lot of, we might say, good thinking on the higher levels in terms of the economy of Lebanon and the quarries of Solomon, of Timnah, the source of the copper mines, they were forgetting about one thing, and that is the people that were involved. And it turned out it was the people that were subjugated to all this labor, forced labor, that eventually led to what? It didn't lead to more buildings, but actually led to the dissolution of the kingdom, of the United Kingdom. And so the people play a rather significant role in the economy in that fashion as well. Next week I'm going to talk about something really quite different. This is a leftover from what I had just before I had this long vacation with you from you folks. But I've been working on some other material, and next week I want to talk about something again that pertains to the Bible and the way the Bible is written.